Dr. Miller, had you heard of the term concentration camp before your service in World War II, and in what context?
Well, before World War II, I went off to the service. I was in high school, and the only concentration camps I recall were those of the internment of the Japanese Americans living on the West Coast. They were taken to various camps because they thought that they may have been loyal to Japan and could serve as spies to naval operations along the California coast. Those are the only concentration camps that I'd ever heard of before entering the service.
What did you know about what was happening to the Jews in Europe prior to what you witnessed at Gardelegen?
Well, nothing. I'm from Michigan, and the subject of the problems of the Jewish population were unknown to young fellows like me. We had, of course, Jewish friends, but no one talked about any atrocities of any sort. I suspect only the people in Washington really know that such things were going on in Europe.
How long after its initial discovery would you say you arrived in Gardelegen?
That's easy, 24 hours. It was on April, let's see, the atrocity was on April 13th. We'd already passed through that area, my army unit, and we'd arrived in Stendal on the banks of the Elbe River. And it was a beautiful spring day, and we were lolling about outside in the sun when a Jeep came up, and some fellows told us to follow them. They had something to show us, and we did, and we drove back westward to Gardelegen, and so it was essentially the next day or 2 days after the atrocity. And it was an eye-opener.
Did you see any survivors of the war crime while you were there?
No, I think the few survivors of that episode were probably taken care of by the medical people. There, as I recall, there may have been 100 or so survivors out of the 1,000 and some victims. As far as we had a lot of experiences and contacts with displaced persons. Displaced persons were people from all over Europe who were working in the fields and factories, the German fields and factories. Essentially, we call them DPs. And there are lots of them, and they had to be dealt with there. And so actually the medical services pitched in right away. They had a terrible problem with lice on the Europeans. Practically everyone, it seemed to me, had carried body lice or head lice. And we had a wonderful system to deal with the matter promptly. We set up delousing stations. The delousing meant 2 squirts from a flit gun with a canister filled with DDT. And DDT did a marvelous job of delousing the European population. Many American medical units were involved right away, and those are a lot of our close contacts with people who were, prisoners of war or displaced persons who had been brought from their homelands to do work in the in the fields and factories.
How would you describe your feelings upon seeing the atrocity at Gardelegen?
Well, it was certainly revealing. I was 19 years old at that time, and of course had never seen anything like it. And we knew nothing about atrocities elsewhere. This is the first instance, and it was a terrible thing, and it was strange because essentially the German military soldier knew the game was up. They wanted desperately to surrender to the American forces. So the question is, how could a small group of Germans lose control and carry out such a terrible thing? We blamed it on the Hitler Jungen, which were young Germans, maybe 14, 15 years old, who were armed, and we know that the atrocity at Gardelegen was carried out partly by Hitler Jungen. They had caused problems with our division as we crossed from the Rhine River to the Elbe. We moved very fast, very quickly eastward. Every now and then there would be a firefight as some Germans would come out of the woods and shoot at the Americans, and so we had to stop, organize some infantry and bring in a couple of tanks and deal with the situation before proceeding eastward. And those situations were mainly caused by the Hitler Jungen, who didn't know any better. They had really no problems with the regular German officers and men. They were very anxious to surrender to us and did so.
What are your thoughts on your role in Holocaust liberation?
In the Holocaust liberation, well, of course, as far as the successes of our division, which was the 102nd Infantry Division, it had to deal with the regular war activities, and in this rapid move eastward, our soldiers were the ones who ran across the atrocities at Gardelegen. Members of I think it was the 105th Infantry Regiment that was in that area. As far as dealing with the atrocities, as I mentioned before, we got busy right away. The problem is there are millions of people from Europe who were left when the war was over. They had no place to go. They had to be fed. I mentioned the delousing stations. We participated heavily in that, and it was very successful.
What about the townspeople when they learned of the atrocity, and also what was the excuse of the Germans to carry this out?
To me, that's the most interesting question of all. When the Gardelegen, that was the atrocity was on April, I think maybe 13th or 14th. Our General Keating was called in, notified right away. He came and surveyed the situation and took command. And the first thing he insisted that all of the local German civilian population be brought or come to or Gardelegen, to see what their own people had done. And that was the fallout from that, I think, was very effective, because word passed around that part of Germany rapidly. We were camped out in Stendal, which was a very nice city that had escaped a lot of the bombing that other cities had undergone. And we found that the local there was a real, this event had a major effect on them. Guilt, and they really caused no problems, I believe, when the people came in to reorganize the country and solve the problems of all these people that had to be sent back to their countries of origin and had to be fed and deloused, and things actually went very well. And the occupation there was.
What was the excuse that the German command gave for this
That was
operation?
As I understand it, it was a very interesting thing. They eventually caught up with the guy who gave the order to put these people in the barn and set a whole thing afire and machine gun everyone who tried to get out. And his excuse or comment was this: to the north of us, the British Second Army was proceeding eastward north of us. And somehow or other, the story got out that displaced persons who were liberated as the British came through heading eastward, those displaced persons turned on the German population with rape and pillaging and the sort of stories that perhaps were true to some extent. And they heard about this down in our sector to the south, and I believe that was the excuse that the officer used when he ordered the elimination of these people. That was his excuse. He was eventually caught and put in prison, where he died not too many years later.
Is there anything else you'd like to add, Dr. Miller? Okay.
Very interesting. I wish I could.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Okay. Thank you so much for the video. Okay.